Hi, and welcome to How to Conquer the World Interviews, the show that spotlights international trade professionals and how they use the internet to conduct global business. I'm your host, Garrett Wasny, and today my guest is Joseph Grasmick, a business immigration lawyer in Buffalo, New York. Along with highlighting the origin and mission of his practice, Mr. Grasmick discusses the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement on Canada US business immigration, how the internet has changed the marketing of legal services, and which occupational categories are being more closely reviewed at the U.S. border.
What's your background? I'm an immigration lawyer since 1979. I've done nothing but immigration law since the day I graduated from law school, and I was actually a joint law and anthropology major in law school. My original idea was I was going to save the world's forest-dwelling Indians. But now I'm an immigration lawyer.
How are you saving the world now?
Well, I'm not saving the world, but I think that Canada and the United States, they're each other's greatest trading partners, and I think in terms of on this side, you get 10 miles away from the border and nobody knows what a Canadian is, much less the rules for Canadians immigrating to the United States. And I think that's my area, really spreading the word, showing U.S. companies how they can hire a Canadian, for that hard-to-fill position, which is now a real challenge, and a real challenge to our economy in general is filling positions that can't be filled. And for Canadian companies that want to expand in the United States and find immigration barriers to, what's supposed to be so-called free trade. I think that's the service I perform.
Why is Canada still a secret in the U.S.?
Well, I think Americans are, and I am one, so I can say it. Look inwards a lot more than other countries, because of historical and geographical and availability of resources. So I know just to send, a letter out of my office to Canada, it's like, well, oh gosh, that's good. How much is that? How do you do it? How do you weigh it? There's just a traditional looking inwards as opposed to looking outwards, Canada or any other country.
The North American Free Trade Agreement, how has that impacted business immigration?
What's made it easier for Canadians? Two things, basically. One is it created an entirely new visa just for Canadians, the TN1. And number two, it made procedures for the TN1 and the L1 easier. You can get the permits right at the border.
Maybe you can just explain those.
Well, the immigration world is divided into three categories. You've got citizenship. You're a Canadian citizen, I'm an American citizen, we were both born in those countries. Then you have people who are permanent residents, that's also known as immigrant status, landed immigrant status, green cards. Those are people who aren't citizens of a country but have the right to live permanently. Then you have a third area, and that's the one that we're talking about, temporary permits, where a person is allowed to come into the United States temporarily to perform a service in that country, to work or to visit, and then intends to go back. And that's where all the action is in NAFTA. NAFTA has created, the two different permits I was talking about, the TN and the L, are two temporary work permits.
Are you aware of any horror stories where someone will try to get into the U.S. or an American trying to get into Canada and they're just unceremoniously stopped at the border?
Tons of horror stories. I hear them all the time over the telephone, in the media. There's internet, articles posted on the internet. On my news group, you'll hear horror stories from time to time. Yes, it happens all the time.
Can you give me some examples?
There's a new summary exclusion or summary removal procedure where a person entering the United States can be barred for a period of 5 years to life summarily. In other words, without an immigration judge reviewing it. And I know there were some Canadians that were caught up in that, and it made headlines. Certainly a small percentage of the total, but I think those are extreme examples of how horrible it can get if the person doesn't do their homework ahead of time and just tries to come down to the United States and works.
What would be the scenario for that kind of extreme case?
It's a common thing in all of those, and I don't know the cases. It's never happened to our clients, so I'm getting it secondhand. But there always seems to be like an element of immigration thinks that the person's trying to fool them. Whenever I see the problems, it's like, well, a person tried at one port of entry and then was denied, and then tried at another port of entry, and then immigration got all upset because, they thought they were trying to do something sneaky. There's a computer system that they're all linked to, so, if you are refused at one port, all the other ports know about it, right away. Or there was another case of not a client, but somebody who called and needed a letter, and the employer authorized this person to sign the letter. It was for a work permit at the border, and then immigration was very upset because they considered that a forgery. So there's elements of fraud, or when they think you're lying or trying to pull something over, trying to fool them, that seems to be a common thread in the horror stories.
Let's say I'm an American company and I want to hire a Canadian or even someone from the UK to work for my company. And what's my first step? What do I do?
The first thing you want to do is find out if you need a work permit or not.
Okay.
A lot of people do not need work permits that come to the United States to visit, even for business purposes, even things that look a lot like work, and that's called the B1. It's like a temporary visitor for business, and there is a page devoted to that on my website, the B1 page. And if that's the case, the person, now you said UK or Canada, so it's a little different, but depending on the country the person's from, a Canadian can just cross the border and state the purpose of his or her trip and is allowed in on B1 status, while somebody from other countries may need to get a passport visa first before they can come in. Now, if you do need a work permit, for most countries you need to file a petition ahead of time and wait a while. The common visa right now is the H1, and they're limited. The number is limited per year, how many can be granted. And if you apply right now today, you wouldn't get it, which is May, you wouldn't get it until October or later.
That long?
That's true. But for Canadians, on the other hand, they can get the permit right on the spot at the border. If the paperwork was together, they could cross any Class A port of entry, which are the big ones, the major ones, and if they qualify, are allowed in with a work permit right away.
You talked about your website, one of the best legal sites I've seen. Tell us about that.
Thank you.
When did that start?
I started in March of 1995.
Do you do all the HTML yourself?
Yes. The one part that I did not do myself was in the second generation of the website, were the graphics, but the rest is, I do all the HTML myself.
I really like these decision tree structures that you have where you provide these different scenarios, and depending upon your circumstances, you're kind of guided into certain information areas. Tell us how you design those.
I'm an author of a book called the Canada US Business Immigration Handbook, which is published by Carswell, the largest law book publisher in Canada, I believe. And I started the website, using just pages from the book, just, very small percentage of the book. And that particular flow chart, it's a flow chart in the book. Now, the flow chart on the website doesn't look anything like it because I had to convert that to, yes, no, and you jump to different parts of the page depending on what button you hit. So in other words, it was a paper document to start with, but you really had to transform the structure of it when you put it on the web. But on the other hand, it's not really that difficult. It's just simple jump commands. You hit a yes button and it jumps to another part of the page. It's very simple.
Do most of your clients use the web?
Now they do. When I started, they did not. As a result of the web, my business model really changed a lot. In the olden days, I guess, in internet years, it's long, but not really that long. Before I'd say 96 or 95, most of my clients were, directly the employers, Canadian companies who wanted to send people down to the United States because of my location in Buffalo. That was, the local market, so to speak. But what happened when the internet site is people that were scattered throughout the United States would find me, and it changed from, starting with the first contact being with an employer. Now it's the employee, the Canadian employee in the United States that's making the first contact, and then going back to the employer and saying, we should really use Joe Grasmick to do our immigration. the type of questions that were asked and the type of people, especially in the initial days, were usually in the IT field because they were ahead of the curve, on the web. They were asking questions about how to get down to the United States, how to get their employers to sponsor them, the intricacies. But now with the increase in the use of the web, the whole market's the same now. Now the employers, I saw some, one of these internet research studies on the web saying that now a lot of the majority of the CEOs of companies are on the web themselves. So now the market has kind of gone full circle, and it's back to what it is before, like employers are contacting me directly.
How has the web changed the way you market a professional service?
Completely changed. Marketing in the olden days, the market for me was Ontario. That was the source of the Canadian companies expanding in the U.S. So it was personal contact, referrals from people who knew you over the years, your traditional, low-key lawyer marketing, the way you get your business, and then, satisfied clients and referrals, word of mouth, presenting seminars, a little direct mailing, very targeted to Canadian companies expanding in the U.S. When we started with the website, all that disappears, and it's now everything is internet.
Would you advertise using banner ads?
No, because really my purpose is to support potential clients and to really get a complex message directly to the client as simply and quickly as possible. I found that the ads detract from that. Plus, I'm not interested in the income that generates because I'm a lawyer, not a web marketer.
You said too that you run a news group.
Yes,
is that correct? Well, what are some?
It practically runs itself. How those go.
What are some common questions that people have?
Do I qualify? Canadian posting a message. Do I qualify to get into the United States? Usually it's the 99% of the Canadians that are coming into the United States are have a very very easy. They're engineers and they show a diploma and maybe a letter from their employer and they're in. It's the the small percentage of people who don't quite fit in a clean category or have something in their background or have a complicated case that really need the website and eventually my services. And you'll see a lot of those questions on the news group. I invite you to take a look yourself and the listeners as well.
What have been some key trends in U.S. business immigration in recent years?
It's like a pendulum. Immigration policy is like a pendulum in the United States. There's a swing towards, and this is if you go back in history, back to the Chinese Exclusion Acts and, very typical of our country, there'll be a very anti-immigrant sentiment. And then there'll be all kinds of restrictive laws, and they will be applied very strictly at the border. Then the pendulum will swing the other way to, liberal, more liberal, and it just goes back and forth over time. Right now, we are coming out of a very hard swing to clamping down on immigration, and that was I referred before to the law that summarily allows the border folks to exclude people without a hearing. That was part of an immigration act that was passed at the height of that anti-immigration feeling. Some people call it phobia. Now we're coming away from that, and things are letting up.
Why? Why are things letting up?
I think it's a natural process. It just goes back and forth, but other people will relate it to the economy. When the economy's good, there's pressure on allowing people in to fill unfilled positions. There's less opposition because there's lots of people at work, and when the economy is bad, the traditional view is that's blamed on immigrants taking away jobs. Now Canadians, nobody hates Canadians. Everybody likes Canadians, but they're part of a general immigration law, in the United States. So when there's a rule that says that there'll be a waiting period for H-1s, that's going to apply for everybody. And Canadians get caught up in it.
There's the laws which are written, and then there's the way the laws are interpreted by individual officers. To what extent is that an issue?
I think it's a big issue with NAFTA because there are very, very complicated applications, whether somebody qualifies or not. Are they a management consultant or not? Does the degree that they have, have to relate to what they're going to be doing? And NAFTA put all this complicated decision-making process onto the guy at the border or the gal at the border, people who have traditionally not had to deal with this. So it's been really challenging because, there's a lot of discretion, and plus these people had to be trained in it, and, there's 200 people waiting in line, and you really need an hour to spend with this, with the person to determine whether they qualify. So that's really important. It's really important how the person applies the law at the border. I think they've been doing a good job, considering everything that they've, that was really placed on them.
What are some do's and some don'ts if you're a business person and you're trying to get entry into the U.S.?
Always tell the truth. Never try to lie or misrepresent, because then you can be barred forever from ever entering the United States. Better to be turned away on that entry than be barred forever. That would be number one. Number two, I would say do a little homework ahead of time. Find out if you need a work permit and get that work permit before everything hits the fan. If you're going to need it. And, most people know, they'll cross down, come down to the United States for a trip, and they'll say, I'm going to a meeting. Okay, fine. And the next time the inspector says, oh, what kind of meeting? Who's going to be there? Well, that by your third visit, you better be prepared with something because, they flagged you. So I think, the second point is to be prepared ahead of time. Don't just, try to wing it if you think you need a work permit. There's some hot work right now. Anybody in the IT professions, I think they're going to be scrutinized. If you say you're coming down as a computer programmer or anything in the computer fields. I would also say if you come down and say the word consultant, that's kind of a hot word, that may trigger a secondary inspection. Those four things are things that come to mind real quick.
You say flagged. Is your record literally flagged?
Traditionally, immigration has had profiles, both profiles where if you fit in that profile, your entry is scrutinized, and there's secret profiles. And also there's just common sense. If a memo comes down and says that everybody's been, we've been too liberal in management consultants, and here's a definition of what they should be, or word of mouth, and that word consultant is going to, raise a red flag, whether it's a formal procedure or informal. And then there is the formal. There is a computer system, and if you are turned away at the border, you're in that computer system. If you've been convicted in Canada of an offense, maybe when you were young, the thing that always comes up is, marijuana offenses 15 or 20 years ago, or college pranks or whatever, that is, there's a very high degree of sharing of information between the RCMP and the people at the border, so that can come up. So in terms of flagging, there are a number of ways that the enforcement people at the border do their duty.
You also talked about certain profiles that they look for. Could you expound on that?
No, I can't, because, it's all secret. There are things that immigration looks for, it's part of their enforcement procedures. And, no, I don't know them, and you couldn't file a Freedom of Information Act request to get them. For example, on the word consultant, the reason I mentioned that is because there is a category of TN for management consultants, and the requirements are very open. In other words, you can have a bachelor's degree, or you can have, 5 years of work experience as a management consultant, or 5 years of experience that relates to the consulting agreement. So you can see those are all in the disjunctive. You can have any one of those, and you can see liberally interpreting that almost anybody could qualify. And indeed, I think that's what people thought for a while, and a lot of people were, well, you don't qualify for anything else, let's put you in the management consultant category. Well, correct or not, if that perception is correct or not, there was, immigration then cracked down on that and will now scrutinize those applications very carefully. Whether that's called flagging or not, I don't know, but I do know that, management consultants will get review. Scientific technicians is another category that get special review, and computer programmers, because computer programmers are not on the free trade list. So those people will get, if you're in the IT field, be ready to prove that you're able to come to the United States on this trip.
What's next for Joseph Grasmick?
Good question. I think short term is I'm into high altitude mountaineering, so I've got a 21,000-foot mountain to climb in La Paz, Bolivia. And then after that, I don't know. I enjoy the internet. The reason I think the site is successful is because I have fun doing it. And I think as long as that fun remains, I'll be doing what I'm doing now.
Joseph Grasmick, business immigration lawyer in Buffalo, New York. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
That was an interview with Joseph Grasmick, a business immigration lawyer in Buffalo, New York. Along with highlighting the origin and mission of his practice, Mr. Grasmick discussed the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement on Canada US business immigration, how the internet has changed the marketing of legal services, and which occupational categories are being more closely reviewed at the U.S. border. The interview was conducted May 28, 1999. I'm your host, Garrett Wasny, and I invite you to explore the other interviews and content on this How to Conquer the World website.